Yeah, so let me start. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining tonight. This is a particular passion of mine, which is Southwest jewelry. And what I wanted to do today is focus on something that is very near and dear to me, which was the first generation of Navajo design and jewelry making. And it will cover the periods of 1878 to 1920. What distinguishes this from other Indian jewelry is that during this period, the Navajo people basically made jewelry for themselves. It wasn't made for the Anglo market, the tourist market. So the designs are very unique in their execution. They have almost a Danish modern quality to them in their simplicity. And it was a very studious and industrious way that they went about making this jewelry. You're talking about one of the most remote lands in the United States, largely agrarian and horsebound culture. And so it's very interesting how they took very simple items and were able to make astonishing pieces of jewelry during this period. And so today we're going to kind of focus on a very unique thing, which is like a birth of a jewelry movement within a tribal unit. And so we're going to focus on the technique and application of the designs, the utilitarian nature of the designs. But the other thing is that it really weaves the whole story of the people during that time too. It's very much a reflection of the changes that society went through during this time period. So when you look at this, it's a place in time. It's 100 years ago, but or more. But it's something that when I look at it from the actual decorative items that were created, it's just an amazing story of one cultural unit and how they integrated silversmithing into their culture. How I came to this, quite interesting, hold on, I'm trying to switch slides, is that I had a great fortune that on my father's side, my aunt actually married into a family of educators that taught English in the Navajo land from 1930 to 1950. And as a result of being out on the reservation and teaching English, they were gifted many pieces of what's known as pawn jewelry. And so I grew up having exposure to this just visiting my aunt down in San Diego. She had, and my cousin now has inherited it, probably one of the best collections of this jewelry that you can imagine. And again, it was gifted by tribal members to them because of their educational support of the tribes very early on. My father's cousin set up a television education system between Shiprock, where the tribe is based, and all the rural trading posts within the Navajo reservation in the 1970s. It was a way of setting up education so that when they weren't tending sheep or helping with their family, children could go into trading posts and be taught the basic language and basic educational building blocks. And so as a result of that, I had a chance to spend a lot of time with him, going out and seeing these trading posts and meeting people and seeing this jewelry. So it's a very personal thing for our family. I have a cousin even today that teaches Navajo children in Farmington, New Mexico. So our family, we have over 90 years of service to the tribal people of the Navajo and Hopi. Again, I grew up with Navajo rugs and jewelry at a very early age, so I was exposed to many of these things that you see here. I started to kind of get into learning more about this first generation 5 years ago. I've been actively collecting it where I can find it. And I want to detail a couple things that I think are really crucial whenever you're trying to learn something, is to be exposed to people that actually have these objects, And so along the way, what was very instrumental to me was meeting certain gallery owners at antique fairs that had these original items, because when you can hold them and you can see them, you can learn a lot about them. And so people along the way that have been very good to me is people at Shiprock Gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Fouts family, Frank Hill Tribal Arts um, um, out of New Mexico, Four Winds Gallery out of Pittsburgh. They all have vast knowledge of this period and actually have antique pieces from this era. The other thing that I have to say is that I've been a lifelong fan of Arizona Highways magazine. In the 70s, they produced 3 editions of magazines devoted to this era and to this jewelry. These are excellent resources to go back in and learn about the things that I'm going to teach you today.
Richard, if I might just jump in, would you prefer that everyone is muted now, just so you know, just when you come in, everybody is muted on the platform, the Zoom platform, but you're certainly welcome to like unmute yourself. Tell me, or would you like to tell the group, Richard, how you would prefer to receive questions, like as you go or at the end, or what do you think?
So I have like this built-in sections. So what I'll do, Marjorie, to make it easy on you, is that I'll go through like 3 slides now, stop, and then if anybody would like to ask questions, so that way we'll have a little bit of ebb and flow. So let me go through these 3 slides and then I'll stop and then you can open it up to the group. I'm more than willing to do that.
Okay, great. That sounds wonderful. And when that does happen, you will be able to unmute yourself for the question. And then please, once you're finished, mute yourself once more. Thanks so much. And I'll let you go, Richard. Thanks.
Yeah, so a little bit about the Navajo people is that they're original descendants of the Paleo Indian hunters that came from Canada and Alaska. And they moved south and they roamed into the area that we now know as the Four Corners and Monument Valley. And there's many, many ruins of the earlier people. They were called the Anasazi. And so you can go and see the ruins at Chaco Canyon. We'll talk about that in a little bit, in Aztec. But they left behind a very rich cultural history of being present there. And their language that kind of evolved is quite interesting, is really the basis of how they recognize themselves. They're called the Denai people, and that relates to the language that they speak. It's very closely related to the Apache language. So if they have a counterpart in the Indian world, they're most closely aligned to the Apache. And so they developed their language in around the 1400 AD. And in 1581, the Spaniards, when they were heading north through Mexico, actually made contact with them. They got confused by the language and thought that when they met them that they were actually meeting the Apache tribe because of similarities in the language. But there is a written record of them making contact with the people. But the most important thing is that the Spaniards were very fearful of the warrior culture that was associated with the Navajo Nation. So they tended to basically go through New Mexico and conquer the Pueblo people. So you have a very interesting relationship where the Navajo people were largely independent from Spanish influence. And the Pueblo people were put under a very strict rule. We'll talk about turquoise mining at Cerrillos. The Spaniards controlled that for over 250 years until they were removed. So anyway, so very long-standing history in the Southwest. Probably the key thing historically for them is that in 1848, Mexico became independent of Spain. And so Spain withdrew from the Pueblos, And what this did was created a huge cycle of warfare and raiding between the Navajo, the Utes, Mexicans, and the Pueblos. So if you go back and you look at kind of the mid-century of the 1800s, there's a lot of recorded histories of battles that took place between these groups. And it wasn't a good time for any of these tribes because they flourished in killing off warriors, taking women and children as slaves. So there's a huge history of that. So there were definitely times of war in their history, but we'll also talk about how they were expert traders in times of peace. In 1846 to 1849, America started sending military forces into Navajo land. They started establishing forts, Fort Defiance and Fort Wingate. So these became outposts in the reservation. Under the New Mexico militia, Kit Carson came in and for 4 years led some very harsh raids into the reservation. In the Canyon de Chelly, they had beautiful peach orchards that were derived from seeds given to them by the Spanish. These were from the 1500s. Kit Carson came in and literally cut down every tree. And so when you talk to Navajo people, they talk about this as the fearing time. Many hogans were burned down, so much so that the Navajo people had to kind of retreat into the really deep parts of the reservation to survive. Those that couldn't survive the winter were forced to go into these forts and surrender. And then they were forcibly removed to New Mexico to a reservation called Bosque Redondo. So you have this whole kind of chaotic period before they were allowed to return. And so you can read about it. It was called The Long Walk and The Fearing Time. There's a lot of really good books on this. But what came out of it was in the 1870s, people started to create treaties to allow them to return to their land. And this corresponded to the start of the railroad that went through the Southwest. You had land leased for livestock to Anglo ranchers. And then you had the creation of the first boarding schools for the children. So children were forcibly removed from the reservation and taught Anglo ways. So you had this very kind of chaotic period that this jewelry came out of, but it was also that you had a lot of cross-cultural pollination. And so when we talk about the silversmithing in this jewelry, we're going to talk about historic technique that was unique to the Navajo. We're also going to talk about things that they learned from the Mexicans and the Pueblos during this time period. So the nation today, quite interesting is that it became a formal entity in 1923. So that's when the tribal government was established. Probably their most noted modern thing is that in 1942, they sent 400 code talkers to basically help in World War II. That exposed them to European technique, Japanese ways. The current reservation is about 27,000 square miles, but the most important thing is that if you just look at the Navajo Nation today, it's larger than 10 of 50 states right now in this country. So as a whole, it's a very sizable land. And they have about 300,000 members, second only to the Cherokee. Any questions? I'll continue. So what distinguishes the Navajo, first and foremost, is that we're an agrarian and hunter-gatherer society. So they were equal parts this. So they have a very strong tradition of hunting and roaming. But what they learned from the Pueblo people to the east is that they learned to grow corn, beans, and squash. So that became central to their thinking. And that was a cultural transfer from the Pueblo people to them. From the Spanish, they learned to maintain livestock, in particular sheep and goats. Sheep were the most reverend animals on the reservation because they provided wool for blankets, which you needed for the winters out there. And so if you look at a lot of the innovation in art, they're very deeply associated with blankets and weaving and rugs. And this is because they brought and traded for the wool with the Mexican and Spaniards that were first there. There's also a very large oral history that the Pueblo people would provide corn and woven cotton. In exchange, the Navajo would give them bison meat, which they would hunt out in the far lands of the reservation. They would trade for hides, and they also would trade for stones, most likely turquoise. And they also had a very strong trading system with the Spanish and the Hopi when they were at peace. And again, during the long walk, what was interesting is that when they were sent out to this reservation at Bosque Redondo, they were actually resettled with the Apache tribe. So there was this integration of many, many different cultures into their society to kind of create it. I like this photo that you see here on the right, because what it does is it shows you some of the early jewelry. So this is, I was taken at the turn of the century. And so if you note what the man is wearing, he has a beautiful shell necklace, and he has two turquoise chaklas, which are the things that you see that are dangling from the shell necklace. You see an early stamped silver badge that's on his knife, and then you see silver buttons that were woven into his pants. So when you look at this jewelry and everything, what's great is that they have a photographic history with the Navajo that dates back into the 1860s. They're one of the most photographed tribes. And it's very interesting is that I'll show you these historic photos, as you can see the development of the jewelry year after year. And it's something that will be very consistent to the talk today. Every culture has its mythology, and the Navajo believe that through their history, it was a journey through 4 worlds. So the first world for them was the dark world, which man and woman was created. The second world was the blue world, which was inhabited by a few mammals. So it was the creation of the animals and the game that they survived on. The third one, which is the most important one from the aspects of jewelry, was called the yellow world. And this is the home of the 4 sacred peaks that define the reservation. So they have 4 unique mountain ranges that define each of the corners of the land. But the most important thing is that each peak was associated with a different gemstone. So the North Peak was associated with jet. Not surprisingly, when we look at the coal mining that takes place on the reservation, it's in the north. In the west, it was associated with the abalone shell. In the south, it was associated with turquoise, and to the east, it was clam. And so this world is very, very important in understanding the elements that comprise this early jewelry, because all of these stones and minerals were sacred to these people and associated to this world. And then the modern world, they define as the glittering world, which is the home of seasons, moon, stars, sun, the current environment that they live in. And so they believe that jewelry is part of this glittering world. But a very deep social and cultural value to the jewelry that you're going to see. And it relates back to these 2 mythical worlds that I'm describing to you. If you look at in the Southwest, you have a very long history associated with the turquoise. If you look at the Anasazi people, they've been able to find beads that were discovered out at at numerous sites that date back to AD 300. In CHACO, quite interesting is they actually found a workshop where these things were made. I'm actually going to show you those beads in a second, but they found 56,000 pieces of turquoise on site at this workshop in Chaco Canyon. It's part of the museum there that you can see. The early jewelry was made with by gluing chips of turquoise to wood, bone, and shell. So you had this element of trading, the abalone coming from the west, the clams coming through the pueblos to the east. And what was quite interesting is that when they went out and looked at mines in the New Mexico, Arizona, and California, over 200 of them had been discovered by the prehistoric Anasazi or Navajo people. So they had great knowledge of turquoise sources and were regularly taking the material to use it both for trade and for jewelry. And the most common thing that they loved to trade for was the spiny oyster from Mexico. So here you can see a bowl to your right that was, it's a carved wood. And then you can see the mosaic that's been applied using a tar-like, glue-like subject. And the great thing about turquoise, it's very porous, and we'll talk about that. So it could be easily shaped and put into these mosaics. Any questions?
Where was the jet?
So the jet was into the north, and it's most associated with the coal seams. So this would be near Cayenta, which is in the northern part of the reservation, just below Monument Valley.
Thank you.
Someone asked what they used for glue.
So it was combinations of resins that were derived from pine tars, things like that. So what we would call pitch. So it would have been like heated tars.
Exactly.
Any other questions? And let me continue. So the first person that was known to make silver jewelry was Adesidi Sane. He was associated with Bosque Redondo. When he was out there, there was two Mexican silversmiths that made bridle bits and decorative buttons. And so he learned from two Mexicans. He started on his own in 1878. And what he started doing was making very simple bracelets. He made, from a utilitarian thing, tobacco flasks. So these were like little canteens that they would hold the tobacco and carry with them on their trips. And then these necklaces and shell inlay. By the turn of the century, he had taught 4 of his sons, which then taught many, many people within the reservation how to make more elaborate things. And so what was added was earrings, concho, buckles, bolos, bow guards, hair ornaments, pins, and squash blossoms. And what you see here is a postcard from 1901. And you can see this gentleman, he has earrings on, he has a shell necklace, he has a very early stage squash blossom. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So when you look at these old photos, and I say you can almost kind of see how this developed over time. And then the first commercial turquoise mine was in Cerrillos in New Mexico. It was developed in tandem with the Tiffany Company. And so turquoise was added at a later date, probably 1900 to 1920. Most of the stones that I'm going to show you probably date more closer to the 1920s. So turquoise, again, was associated with the South Peak, and it was a sacred stone. So it was of value to them. And, you know, again, we have this great history of it being used by the Chaco people. But you don't see many photos of it actually in and around the turn of the century. This is a man that we're going to talk to named Awa Sita. He was not Navajo, but he was a very accomplished silversmith that worked in Manitou, Colorado in 1930. This was a photo taken of him at the trading post. What's quite interesting, though, if you look at the jewelry that his family is wearing, you can see that his daughter on the right is wearing a coin necklace. He has a very early pure silver squash blossom, and he's wearing a silver bracelet. You can see that his son and daughter have simple silver buttons tied to their velvet clothes. And you see that his wife has a traditional shell tab necklace with the double jacla. So this would probably have been very typical of what you would see in a family unit on what they would have worn to ceremonies or put on display. And again, you know, this is a person that's not Navajo. He was a Pueblo Indian, but he made Navajo-like jewelry for one of the first trading posts. We'll talk more about him. He was a very accomplished gentleman. But this is very typical of the jewelry that you saw at the turn of the century. The Navajo had a very brave chief named Chief Manuelito. And this is a painting that is in New Mexico. And it's quite interesting is that you see here is that he's wearing a very simple shell necklace that has red clamshells, a spiny oyster, and a white clamshells. You don't see any turquoise that's associated with this. So again, this is a man that was a chief. So it's very interesting that he wears a traditional blanket, has his bow and arrow, has his gun. You can see his deerskin moccasins, but you can see that, you know, even royalty in themselves, they did not have elaborate displays of jewelry in the early days. These are the 4 stones that are associated with 4 peaks, and each of them have a different meaning to the Navajo. So the white clam, which comes from the east, it's thought to be, by wearing it, assisting with your critical thinking. It's most associated with the tree of life, which to them was corn. It also represented the light of Father, Son. It also represented a hope in life. So by wearing this, this was kind of reconnecting you to the spirit world and these value systems that were associated with it. Turquoise, which came from the south, was associated with the future, faith in holy ones and family, and the water of life because of the nature of it being blue. Abalone is most associated with the creation of the language itself, love, unity, and air. And jet was about self-awareness and respect. So when I talked to Navajo people that work in the traditional arts, many times they give prayers before they start and make an actual piece. And so they like to combine these typical elements into their design. What's not inherent in the early design, which we're going to point out, is the use of coral. That came much later in the 1930s, and we're going to talk about that, how that was brought. It's a very good way of distinguishing the age of these items. So this is a young man that I really think highly of. To the right, his name is Zeke, and Naaba'ahe'e. He's a very unique individual in that he just got a major scholarship to go to the main Indian design school in New Mexico. But over the last 3 years, he's pioneered the use of traditional bead making. and he only uses historic tools. And he's getting quite a bit of acclaim now within the reservation and within the community as kind of reviving the traditional way that things were made. Quite interesting is that what you see here is he's using a pump drill to basically drill a hole in a shell. It's identical to the pump drill that was used to make these beads over at Chaco Canyon 800 years ago. So what you see on the left is part of the 56,000 pieces of turquoise that were discovered in Chaco. What I love about this gentleman, Zeke, he's all of 18, but he's literally in the last 3 years is reviving this traditional way of making things. So it's a very, very simple set of tools that they use to make these necklaces. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about this technique. So this is actually his workbench. And he was so kind to send me these photos. And so the tools that he uses, which is quite interesting, is that he uses yucca leaves to basically brush and clean the stone. His one thing that he uses that's modern is the multi-tool. He uses that for chipping away and filing rock if he needs to get some edges. He uses rasp and hand files for grinding and chipping away materials as well. He uses some mini diamond tools to basically refine it. But what's interesting is that the pump drill is traditional. The slab of sandstone that he uses to shape and grind is traditional. And so quite interesting when you look at his bench is this combination of old and new. And here's some other things that he uses. And again, it's taking things and reusing them in very creative ways. He has a broken drill shaft that he uses for splitting rocks. He uses rough and fine sandpaper. He uses an old Swiss Army knife. He uses stones that are hand and palm grinders. Those are made from different sandstones that have different grit. He uses a hatchet head for splitting rocks. He doesn't even own a hammer. And then he uses, a claw hammer to break apart big rocks. So again, all of this could be recreated, just with simple stones instead of these metal tools. But by and large, this was the jewelry bench that he used to make these exquisite historic pieces. And just to show you some of the things that he's doing, which is quite interesting, so he's actually going back and not even using steel in the drill bits. He will go out and prospect and find a piece of quartz, which he'll break away the crystals. And then what you'll see is that he'll basically rub them with sandstone to get them into like a needle-like thing. And then he'll add them to the base of his pump drill. So what he's using to basically drill is, essentially the same thing that the prehistoric people used, which was quartz. So it's quite fascinating how he's been able to go back and kind of recreate how this stuff was made hundreds of years ago. So one of the things that were essential to these necklaces was trading and access to different shells. So there's different ones that have been inherent to making jewelry. You have the black shell, which is called the pen shell. You have the white clam, which is used to make white hishi. You have the traditional abalone that's found on our coast. So they basically break these things up, and then using these drill bits and these tools, they break them off into small chunks to where they can be drilled, and then they're hand rolled on sandstone. So what he's done is he's drilled a whole length of clam shells. He wets the sandstone and then he hand rolls it with his hand, much like he would be making pasta. And so he basically gets through this rolling mechanism, he gets perfectly rounded shells or hishi. And then what he can do is that once they're done is that he can restring it and add these other tab elements, which are turquoise and oversized pieces of shell. So it's pretty amazing, and I say this to you, is you can't get much more primitive than a slab of sandstone and a couple sheets of sandpaper. And that's all this gentleman requires. And again, he keeps them wet to where they're easily, shed the excess material. So turquoise was reverend and jet was reverend because they're very soft stones. Their Mohn scale is about 5 to 6, but in particular, they are easily shaped manually using sandpaper and sandstone. So when we look at these early pieces of turquoise and the jewelry design, understand that all of this was basically made remotely using these same techniques. So when I show you this jewelry, what's amazing is that all of the stones were basically shaped by hand using these two simple devices, sandstone and sandpaper. So these were things that were brought out to the reservation and were done on site by the different families. So here you can see he's taken stones and he's shaped them into these tabs, and then he'll take them and put them through the drilling process using the pump drill. Any questions?
Someone asked what was their source for their silver.
We'll talk about that in 1 second. I have a slide about that. So it's quite interesting on how they were pretty ingenious on that.
Okay.
So that's coming in a couple slides. So we'll spend some time and talk about that. But in terms of these shell necklaces that you see here, again, very simple technique. They can make a necklace usually in about 4 or 5 hours. Very easily done.
And what's really good is when a person makes those is how smooth they are. The smoother they are, the more money they are.
Yeah, I agree. And if you want to,
Question.
yeah, please. Yes, Elaine? Are you asking a question?
Will you be discussing the spiny oyster shells coming up?
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. So those
Okay, thank you.
Those were traded from Baja, California, and they came up through the Pueblos,
Right.
People. And so there's a 1,000-year history of them trading various things to get at those shells. And they're very reverend even today, and used.
But you're going to be discussing that, right?
Yes, I will.
Will you? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions by anybody? I'll continue. So here you see a woman. This was taken at the turn of the century, so 1900. So traditional wool dress, blanket dress. You can see very simple shells that were made of white clam. And what you see here is a modern piece done by Zeke that kind of mirrors this image. It was done out of respect. This was his great-great-grandmother, I believe. And so you can see that that you have the traditional jaclos, which are the turquoise. But if you actually look at the shells themselves, it was a combination of tabs made from larger shells and then these rounded beads. And then you have this cotton wrapping that's on the very end. So what you see on the right was made this year. What you see on the left was made 120 years ago. And it's basically virtually the same. So there's really no difference. What you see here, she has an 8-strand, maybe 7-strand necklace. Here on the right, you see it's 3 strands. So again, the basic technique is around the spirituality of the stones. So when you look at these older pieces, bear in mind that usually it's some combination of clam, turquoise, and abalone. This is a more modern piece made with coral. when you see these pieces, this gives you a very good way of dating because coral didn't become available on the reservation until the 1930s. It was brought in by a very known trader on the Zuni. And so whenever you see somebody that brings you something that's made of coral, understand that it can't be from this classic period. They had no knowledge of coral. It was brought in from Sicily and in the Mediterranean by one trading organization. So when you see these things, it kind of gives you a basis to date whether it's old versus new. And I want to share with you that some of these pieces can be quite elaborate. So here you see a photo that was taken in 1900 of a young Navajo squaw with her child. And if you look at what she has on, is almost identical to the piece that you see to the right, which is modern. So again, some of it can be very gaudy, but it's all made of the same basic materials, which are these white clam heishi, maybe a little bit of maybe jet or abalone. And you can also see that she's wearing a very primitive squash blossom. We'll talk about those in a second. Those came about right about the turn of the century. So this photo to the left is very consistent with adoption of the techniques. One of the things that you need to bear in mind is that the railroad had a huge impact on the Navajo. Again, in the 1870s, you had the expansion of the railroad through the Southwest. It ended up going through the reservation, going to the Grand Canyon, then ending in California. And there was a person named Fred Harvey who created a whole series of restaurants along the way for guests to jump off the railroad, have a nice meal. He created gift stores, and he created items that could be used for trading. So what's quite interesting is that when you look at this time period and you see like this traditional shell making, there was another side of the Navajo that they were very keen to get modern goods and integrate them into their art. So one of the things that they loved, because they loved wool and weaving, is that they were one of the first people to basically get spun wool from Germantown, Pennsylvania, and that was pre-dyed. And so this rug that you see here, it's a saddle blanket for a horse. It was made in 1880. So about the same time that this jewelry was being made. So they did have access to things through the railroad, and one of them became silver, and one of them became coins, and one of them became cut turquoise stones. So when we talk about jewelry, it's really important when we date these things to understand is that you had this modernization going on in certain parts of the reservation due to the expansion of the railroad into that territory. So this is a beautiful blanket that you see here. The swastika that you see in the pattern is known as twirling logs. And it was very much a standard motif to Navajo jewelry. So when we look at early pieces of Navajo jewelry, when we see these swastikas, we know that it dates it to a historical period of time, because with the rise of Nazism, the Navajo people banished the use of swastikas in the late 30s, early 40s. So when we see these swastikas, we know that it's an historically important piece, dated pre-1930s. This is a gentleman that you can see is using the same pump drill as Zeke. This was taken in probably 1900, and it's part of a historic photo collection that's maintained by Arizona State. So there was a very famous photographer that came in. There's a collection that's been very well known and documented of Hishi that was part of the Jerry Jockla estate. What's quite interesting is just knowing a little bit about the use of these materials, you can kind of date these necklaces that are here on the right. So the one that you see here in the middle, which is the pure shells, this is probably a traditional older piece that probably dates from 1880 to 1900, just because of the use of the materials. Turquoise really wasn't discovered until 1905. So the piece that you see on the right has elements of turquoise with the jockla. It also has elements of the spiny lobster or oyster. Sorry about that. By the way, spiny lobsters make good meals. Spiny oysters do not. So anyway, that's a culinary tip for today. But anyway, so you can see that this one has some of the red spiny oyster shell. So again, this would have been a traditional trading material. And then you see on the one at the very left is the combination of the clamshell and very early turquoise. What's great about this is that this has a grain cast to it, which is very consistent with Chirrillos turquoise that was mined in New Mexico during the same period. So when I look at these pieces, I can guarantee you that the one in the middle and the one on the left are very consistent with the years that you see here. And probably the one on the right was made a little bit later. So it's understanding these nuances of material will help you to go out and find these and to authenticate them and to, you know, purchase them and add them to your collections. The other thing that came about was the first use of silver. And so there's a variety of designs that were developed during this period, this earlier period. And you can see this couple, this was taken right at the turn of the century. And it's amazing in the fact that it gives you a good sense of the jewelry that was worn by both people. So you see that both men and women wore earrings, so they were unisex. You can see that on the left, this man has a beautiful early squash blossom. It was made with handmade beads, which they call Navajo pearls. You can see that it does not have the distinctive squash blossom. And that was a design that was inspired and brought through the Moorish people to the Spaniards and Mexicans, based on the pomegranate, not the squash. So you can see that this early one does not have the actual flowers. You can see that he has clamshell beads. You can see that he has an early concha belt. We'll talk about those. The woman on the right has an amazing concha belt. She has these items that dangle off of it that were for adornment. And one of them is actually one of these tobacco flasks. That's to the very right. And then you can see that she has a very elaborate shell bracelet with a jockla. So this is very typical of the jewelry that you see, very simple in design. The things that you see on the right are from the same era. And so you see the Naha, which is the end piece of the squash blossom. Sometimes it had turquoise, sometimes it was pure silver. You can see that sometimes they added coins to the bead sequences. Sometimes they added these squash blossoms. The cross that you see here is not a religious thing, but actually a dragonfly symbol. So this is actually not a Christian emblem, but rather a traditional design called the dragonfly. So all of these pieces were probably made during the same time period. And again, they were made very simply, and we'll talk about that technique in a second. Here's a photo from 1901, which is amazing. This person, if you went out to Gallup, New Mexico, you could see him in the line at the Home Depot. But you can see that he has a beautiful shell necklace on. That's very indicative of the things that I told you about, which are clam and oversized shells. So very simple adornment, more kind of a day-to-day look. And then on the right, you see the first use of turquoise in a squash blossom. That's probably from 1910. And then you see an early concha belt that was made as an adornment. So very simple piece of silver. Silver wire was added to it, and then simple cutouts and stamps done to it. So very, very simple in their design. So how were they able to do all of these things? One is that they were very resourceful because of the railroad. They could go in and they could get access to coins. So American silver coins were very desired. And they would melt these down and make sheets of ingot. They also loved Mexican pesos, which they could get through trading through the pueblos to the east, or direct trading with Mexicans that were near the reservation. So a lot of the early jewelry was basically melted down coins that were basically stamped out and pounded into sheets. They had access to hammers. So this was something that they would trade for and valued. What you hear on the right is you actually see a setup where he's actually making a bracelet. So you can see he's using a hammer. He has a file that has stamps in it to make decorative things. They used a cottonwood stump. And then to that, they would add sometimes a railroad tie or an anvil. That would be the service that they would be able to work at. They had simple iron crucibles to melt the coins. Once the silver was melted and laid out in a sheet, it was usually pounded to even thickness. And then they used shears to basically cut out the shape that they wanted. So if they wanted to make a bracelet, they would cut off a strand of silver from the sheet. They wanted to make any of these other items that I'm going to show you, they would just adjust what they needed. They definitely used bellows to basically blow air into the furnace to intensify the heat to melt these things. Stamps were made simply from taking old files and then on the end of them making decorative markings that could be stamped into the silver. And then when they were done with the fires in these furnaces, they would take the fine ash, and that was used to polish the silver to get it to a very high luster. And then they would use buckskin just to polish it. So again, very, very simple setup. You can see many photos that were taken of these early silversmiths, and they almost all have one or all of these elements at their workstation. Any questions?
Excuse me.
Carla wanted to know how when they started working with sheet silver.
So the sheet silver came to the reservation mostly in the 60s and 70s. So when we had the big turquoise boom in the 1970s, that's when you saw a lot of machine-made bezels, wire, and sheets used to make jewelry because it was just very efficient. In the early days, they actually wanted heavier pieces, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the traditional Navajo jewelry that they made for themselves was typically of this heavier ingot. When they started the tourist trade in the 1920s, what happened is that women did not like the gaudiness and the heaviness of the jewelry. So there was a whole group of companies that were based in LA that made lighter versions of these traditional items. So it's quite interesting is that by the weight of it and the heft of it and the nature of the stamps, you can date it to this period. The things that came later were typically lighter in the gauge of the silver and the length of the bezel and the like. Any other questions? So this is
Sorry, Richard. I'm sorry. I just am now reading it. It says, was the jewelry only worn by more elite people or by everyone?
everyone.
Everyone.
So it's a form of wealth. The other thing is that's very important about the Navajo people. It's a matriarchal society, and so jewelry is maintained in the family and divided out amongst women in the family. So when I was out there in the 70s with my cousin visiting these trading posts, a lot of jewelry is held by families and it's never sold. It's just maintained by the families and they wear it as a part of a set of heirlooms. So these traditional pieces that you're seeing here very rarely come to market because usually they're maintained by the traditional families. So they're a source of pride. And I have to say that I've been collecting for 5 years and I've been able to find 6 pieces in 5 years. So they're not very common, very hard to find.
Thank you.
So this is a beautiful design that I want to share with you. It was built at the turn of the century, but it talks about all the goodness of what their silversmiths really could do. And this is what's called a traditional keto or a bogard. So what this is a sheet of silver that protects your wrist from when you pull back on an arrow and release it. So it protects your wrist from abrasion. And so it's a protective item, it's a utilitarian item. But what you see here is it's a piece of silver that's wed to a piece of buckskin. So this was basically a cuff. The silver was on the top, the buckskin wrapped around your wrist and it was tied together. Sorry about that, I don't know why we're having a echo. Anyway,
No, no.
Anyway, I'm going to continue as can everybody hear me? Okay. So anyway, this keto, what you see here is that the designs were made with these different file stamps.
Okay.
So each one of these you can see was hand stamped. And then in the case of these 4 external designs, they were actually, he went on the inside of the piece of silver and raised it out to give it a repose finish. And then you can see that he used different stamps on the outside to make kind of these traditional patterns. These things are especially rare. And I say this to you, these are some of the most sought after things. Again, they were utilitarian, they're called ketos. And in my opinion, they're some of the most beautiful jewelry that was made during this period. And again, it was made for Navajo people to be used by Navajo people. These were never sold to the tourists because there was no need to produce this. But these are things that you see that are maintained by families through the years and are very valued. In the 1900s, you had a major mine that was discovered in Cerrillos, New Mexico. And it became the foundation for the first turquoise jewelry that was came onto the market. And what's great about Cerrillos turquoise is that it comes in 2 colors. It comes in Tiffany blue. So when you look at the Tiffany box that you get at the store, that was actually patterned after the shade of turquoise that was mined here. Tiffany had a shaft and a mine claim here for about 20 years. And then it also came with this really beautiful deep green color. And it's very unique to this mine. So when we look at these early pieces, this was really the only commercial mine that was going. So what we'd like to look for in these pieces of jewelry is we'd like to look for aging in the color. So these stones tend to turn more green, dark forest green over time. They typically will start getting cracks because, again, they're hundreds of years old. So through use, cracks are not a bad thing. You see here in this bracelet here, as you can see that how he made the silver bezel is that he didn't have solder to complete it. So right at the center stone, see there's a line above. That's where the bezel was brought together and melted onto the bracelet. It's ingot. So you can see that on the back of the bracelet, you can see that it was stamped and molded out of a probably likely several silver coins. So again, this is something that dates it to this 1900 to 1920. And these are really exquisite things to behold. I have a ring that was made in 1910 from Cerullos, and it's just stunning on how it was executed using these techniques. One of the things that we look at, though, is that it's good to know your mine history. So this was a bracelet that has a stone called blue gem. And this is a mine that started mining in the 1930s. Some other stones that are really known in the turquoise world is Bisbee. That wasn't discovered till 1953 was the first deposit. So when we go back and we look at these historic pieces, one of the things that we try to do is look at the source of the turquoise, because it gives us a really good idea of when something was made. So this piece was probably made in 1930 using many of the same techniques of hand stamping, ingot, hand-shaped stone. But the difference is that it can't be dated to 1900 to 1920 because the mine was not in existence till 1931. So this is something that when you're collecting these things, it's really good to know about mine history and the nature of these stones. When we go and look at these other pieces, all of these are the classic Cerullos, and these are the colors that you should look for if you're interested in collecting these types of pieces of jewelry. So this is a authentic Cerullo stone. It's this very beautiful pale blue. Again, if you look at that color, it's this identical color to the Tiffany box. So it has a very unique color. You can see that this bracelet was hand stamped out of a sheet of ingot, uses these simple file decorations that were stamped into it. So again, when you're out and you're looking at it, it's really important to kind of know about this mine and these stones, because the mine was finished in 1920. So none of this jewelry could be beyond that date. This is a beautiful bracelet that I love. Again, it has everything that you would want to attribute to it. It has the unfinished bezels on the top. You can see on the left, he had to crimp the silver to cover the bead. What's interesting is that he took a piece of turquoise that had been drilled and probably used in a necklace and was repurposed into this bracelet. The center stone is classic forest green Cerullos. The stone on the right is the classic light blue Tiffany color. So it's kind of interesting is that he took this bead and added it to two Cerullo stones. Again, this has to be between the period of 1900 and 1920. These are examples of early rings. What marks these stones is that the stones were hand-shaped. So they were using simple sandstone and sandpaper. So they don't have a luster or a polish. They're more waxy. It's because of the technique. The stones on the left are the classic green color that you see of Cerullos. You notice the stone on the very left has a crack in it. That's a good thing. That says that it was authentic to the period, probably heavily used, cracked, while somebody wore it. The one on the middle has the classic green and blue of it. And the one on the right is the classic Tiffany colors. Again, what distinguishes this old jewelry is that it's not made using modern grinding techniques. So the lusters are off. They're hand polished using sandpaper and just buckskin. This is probably the most exquisite piece that I've ever seen on the early stage. This was made using a technique called casting. So this pattern that you see here for this belt buckle was basically carved into sandstone. The silver was poured over it, and then they applied each of these turquoise stones to this belt buckle. This is an exquisite piece. It's held by Frank Hill Tribal. I had a chance to see this stone this belt buckle in person. It dates from 1900. It's even has the original leather that was in the belt. And it's just a really exquisite piece. These things now, just to give you a value, rings can be found from this era for as cheap as $150. This belt buckle would have an easy value of $5,000 to $7,000 if you ever encountered something like this. And again, it has all the hallmarks of what you want to see in a vintage piece. It has the traditional Tiffany blue and green of Cirillos. So again, we know that this is authentic to the period. But this is probably the most beautiful piece of Navajo jewelry that I've seen from this era. It probably took this gentleman many, many hours to hand carve this, pour the silver, the ingot, and then to apply these stones. Very elaborate piece. To me, it's just stunning. So that kind of ends it for the traditional Navajo jewelry. So again, you get a good sense of what these things are. It's very important when you look at the other jewelry, kind of how everything kind of evolved. And this will be probably the next talk that I talk about is, 1920 to modern times. But what changed the style of the jewelry was really the influence of the expansion of trade in and near the reservation. So we talked about the railroad going through in 1870 to 1900, allowing the exchange of goods between the Navajo and the rail system. Fred Harvey greatly expanded it to auto routes as well. So you had some very important hotels that were established around Route 66. One of them was the El Navajo and Gallup. You had the establishment of Santa Fe as a major tourist destination. So you had the creation of the La Fonda Hotel. And then at the Grand Canyon, they had the establishment at the El Tovar. And what came out of this was that Fred Harvey became a champion of Navajo design and Southwest Indian design. And so what he was able to figure out is that tourists actually didn't really like Indian-made jewelry. They liked more machine-made stamped jewelry. So he employed a company called Bell Trading, Mizell's, several other companies to start making identical jewelry, but it was made out of machine sheet silver. It was machine stamped using these traditional designs. So when you look at jewelry from the 1920s to 1930s, you see kind of this Anglo invasion of the Navajo technique. You had a lot of trading posts that were established within the confines of the reservation that started selling these items, both Navajo made and machine made, to the public. You had the establishment of Route 66. And then very important trading post outside was one that opened up in Colorado and Manitou called Garden of the Gods in 1929. And some beautiful traditional Navajo jewelry was made there under the auspices of a Pueblo Indian. And we'll talk a little bit about him. And then there was this amazing man called Charles Garrett Wallace, who basically, and in the Zuni Pueblo basically introduced turquoise and coral. And so started the whole Zuni jewelry movement. And that happened in about 1918. So all of these forces of people on the east wanting to go west, having supply chain people that got into the trade, taste changing around the jewelry to more modern Anglo, really kind of allowed this first generation of jewelry to fade. And just to show you some of the pieces that were developed outside of the Navajo reservation, so you get a sense of the beauty of these items, but how different they were. One of the people that I really like is a person named Ewa Sida. And he was a very interesting person in the fact that he was a Pueblo Indian. He became very accomplished as a painter, was recognized by the Smithsonian and the Santa Fe Society, so much so that in 1931, he started making jewelry based on designs. And he used it using traditional Navajo technique. So he made beautiful bracelets that were stamped out. And when you see these Garden of the God pieces, what was unusual about them is that they, on the back, he had his own stamp with his name. And the Garden of the Gods actually had their own silver hallmark as well. So what kind of distinguishes these pieces from the earlier pieces is that the artist was recognized, and then it was the first use of hallmarking. So the earlier pieces were made for Navajo. There was no need to hallmark it or to understand who made these pieces. And so there's not a lot of history of silversmithing done during this period by individual artists. In the 1931 on is when you had this whole movement for artists to be recognized, trading posts to be recognized, and hallmarking to be applied to the silver. This is one of the paintings that resides in the Smithsonian. So he was a very, very accomplished artist. You can see almost modern jewelry-esque styling with the animals. On one side is you have the mountain lion. On the other side, you have the gray fox. So he incorporated these into pins and other beautiful jewelry. And then the other thing that makes them exquisite is that he didn't reduce his palette to just turquoise, but he used many, many modern stones. So there's beautiful blue calcite, blue agates, petrified wood, jet, that were incorporated into his style of jewelry. So again, it has kind of like this heavy ingot look. It has some of the traditional elements of Navajo, but again, it was made for tourists, much more colorful than what you saw that was being made in the early period. So this kind of shows you this transition that took place between the traditional and this Anglo period. And then another person that I do want to recognize that when we talk about bead making and traditional necklaces, a person that you should really research was a very known person that worked on the Zuni reservation. His name was Likia de Yuze. But he was the one that basically created and integrated fetishes into beadwork and these tabs. And his pieces are absolutely exquisite. Oftentimes his pieces get confused with these traditional Navajo necklaces. And so you can see, here's two historic photos of him working from the 1950s. So you can see he's using a modern grinding wheel. That's why we know it's a more modern photo of him. But you can see just his use of turquoise was very, very different than the traditional Navajo. So he was more about the bling than the traditional stones. But these are probably the most coveted non-Navajo pieces that were created during this earlier period too. Here's an example of the fetishes that he made. So they were done using coral. So again, this dates it to post 1930. But you see he has little carved foxes and birds that are in between the turquoise and the coral. Just to give you a value, this strand right now, if you were to try to find it in the open market, you would have to pay at least $15,000 for this 3-strand. So these are some of the most desired pieces of this Southwest jewelry. So this kind of concludes my talk. Thank you again for allowing me to talk. And I need to turn on a light so you can actually see me. But anyway, I want to thank everybody for letting me tell you about something that's I'm very passionate about, which is this first generation Navajo jewelry. I'd like to open it up to any questions people have.
I have one. Mr. Richard,
Yes.
just a quick question. Did they make any differentiation in the different colors of the shells, like the spondylus shells, the spiny oyster, from the creamy color to down the purple? Was one more valuable than the other?
What's interesting is that if you look at the Pueblo people, they tend to use more the black pen shell. They do a lot more of the hand-rolled turquoise, Elaine, so you definitely see that. You see a lot more of the spiny oyster. What's interesting, when you go into the Pueblos and you look at historic pieces, they did a lot of this gluing of turquoise onto those spiny oyster shells. So they have a much deeper
The shell thing
tradition
itself.
in the Pueblos of using these things than the actual Navajo. The Navajo are more around the white clamshell, the abalone. That's what I've seen. And sometimes these turquoise jocklas, these 2 strands that form the centerpiece of it. But when I look at these early photos, you very rarely see these jocklas of turquoise. Sometimes you see jocklas of white clam as well. And then I should say that the other people that were very exquisite in terms of bead making, in California, we had the Pomo people, and they used the white clams as well. And so if you would, if you want to do some research, just looking at Pomo bead making, you can Google it. There were some very exquisite pieces that were made by the California tribes as well.
And the spiny oyster shells are now illegal. You can't mine or take those anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting is that Zeke, who I showed is doing this traditional, he was just gifted a cachet of them.
Oh, wow.
And so I follow him and what he does. And again, I like somebody who's using, a traditional technique to bring something back. And they're really, and I say this too, exquisite and true.
Thank you.
Hi, Richard. We have another question. Do the Navajos tough silversmith to Bezunian hoppy? If yes, when?
So each of the tribes has a different tradition around jewelry making. So there's a very long tradition of clans and families within the Navajo land that are generations of jewelry makers. So I know of many different Navajo people that I've met along the way, where they have 2 or 3 generations where they've learned it from, the elders. So in the Navajo land, you have a very strong tradition of teaching and bringing it down through clans, and it became a source of income. So that's very well documented, and you can collect literally generations of families. And there's some very well-known artists, but the 2 best Navajo jewelers right now are Lee Yazzie and his brother. They just had major museum shows called the Glittering World. So look up Lee Yazzie and Glittering World if you want to see how exquisite Navajo jewelry has been expanded. So there's a very strong tradition in Navajo land of this generational aspect of silversmithing, the use of turquoise, and traditional design. I can highly recommend a gallery called Waddell. It's Waddell, a gallery in Scottsdale. Gene Waddell has been one of the greatest champions of Native American goldsmiths, and everybody that's within his roster literally make exquisite pieces to the level of the finest Anglo houses. I mean, it's like the Tiffany or the Cartier of Native American. So if you want to really see what modern design is within Navajo land, check out Waddell Gallery. Really fascinating location. Now, you mentioned the Hopi. The Hopi have two traditions in jewelry. One is that they do not like stones so much as silver overlay. So typically what they would do is they would use a saw and carve out an area within a sheet of silver and then back it with a solid piece of silver. They would join that together using solder, and then they would use the stamping technique with the file to put patterns in the negative area. And then they would use an oxidation method, usually with sulfur, to turn that area black. And you can see these beautiful pieces. They're called a Hopi overlay. They have a very long tradition of making this over the last 70, 80 years. But they had an amazing man who's considered the Picasso of jewelry, and that was Charles Lolema. And Charles Lolema broke away from this Hopi tradition and pioneered the use of multi-stone inlay. He did this in the 60s and 70s. He had an international following and sold to the highest levels. I saw a show of him in San Juan Capistrano in 1978, and the bracelets were $7,000. And that had a big impression on me because my Toyota Celica cost me $3,500. So they were the price of two cars when I saw this show. But if you want to see really exquisite jewelry done in a very different style that's uniquely Hopi, it was Charles Lolema. His niece is still working out of his studio. He passed away in 1990. Her name is Sonwai, Sonwai, and she's doing the same style, but it's exquisite inlay work, and it's done to a level of modern jewelry that you can't believe. And I can't say enough good things. If you want to just see the most beautiful jewelry on earth, just check out the Charles Lolema sites that are out on Pinterest. The Pueblos are very different in the fact that you have a strong tradition of bead making. And so in the Zuni lands, they've had a very strong tradition of making these beads and these fetishes. And these have been very much tied to different families. So like a very big family, it's kind of like the Smiths of the Zunis is the Lovatos. And I can't tell you how many Lovatos there are that are making jewelry, but again, multi-generation, and everybody's stayed on the family tree, and everybody's making these traditional necklaces and fetishes. Super, super beautiful. The other thing that the Zuni excelled with is simple inlay. The difference between Zuni and Navajo, though, is very interesting, is that from a religious basis, they believe that turquoise should be in its purest state. So you don't see much spiderweb turquoise that's used in their jewelry. Almost all of their inlay is pure blue. And they had some favored mines that they could get these colors. Sleeping Beauty, which was sold on Home Shopping Network for many years. They loved that turquoise because it was a very pure blue. They liked a deeper blue from a mine in Arizona called Morenci. So when you look at these historic inlay pieces of the Zuni, they have elements of shell, coral, a lot of the use of this pen shell, this black shell, jet, was very important to them as well in their designs, mother of pearl. But the Zuni jewelry is very unique stylistically because it's these pure tones of the stones. Any questions?
Richard, there,
Yes.
can you, okay, I didn't know if you could hear me. There was a question, do you know any other flea markets besides Scallop that are known for finding Navajo jewelry? And before you give an answer for that, Mel also said that, which we all know from the club, that she sells a lot of Native American Indian jewelry at the old antique barn in San Juan Capistrano. And her space is number 108. And she said there's a huge showcase full of it right now. And if you mention her name, Melinda Churchfield, they will give her they will give whoever's purchasing a discount. And if they don't, they can always call her and she will authorize it. And somebody asked also, Mel, if it was open right now.
The store's open right now, but not this very second. But during the daytime, it's open, yes.
Okay. And what are the hours?
You know, I think they're open from 11 to 5 right now. They used to open at 10, but I think they are opening a little later now at 11.
Okay.
11 to 5 every day.
Okay, so the old antique barn in San Juan Capistrano, and Mel is space number 108. But then to add to that question, Richard, is there anywhere else that you know of?
Yeah, so people that are very reputable in the space that I can recommend to you. There's a person named John Krena, Krena. He and his wife, Carol, of all places, have run one of the largest Native American jewelry stores out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's called Four Winds, W-I-N-D-S. And he specializes in modern Navajo artists, but occasionally he gets exquisite turn-of-the-century pieces, but very reputable. All of the turquoise that I've seen described in his jewelry has been properly attributed to the right mine. So I highly recommend John and Carol in Pittsburgh. They're the best on the East Coast. The Fouts family is legendary for running many trading posts in and around New Mexico and on the reservation. But they have many generations of traders. But Dan Fouts runs Shiprock Gallery in Santa Fe, probably the most exquisite collection of historic pieces in this country, bar none. On any given day, he probably has 50 to 100 of these pieces. So if you want to go in, very reputable dealer. One of the problems that you'll find though with Dan is that he's in Santa Fe and he has to pay Santa Fe rents. So in terms of the general pricing, he's going to be on the high side. Other person that I like a lot is Frank Hill Tribal Arts. He's in New Mexico as well. He only works on these pieces from 1880 to 1920. Many of the photos that you see in this presentation come from his private collection. He's in his late 60s. He loves his pieces, so it's when he wants to make them available for sale. And then where I've got most of my pieces, to be honest with you, is I've got them at estate sales. One of my most valued pieces I just bought is a horse's head that I got that was simple stamps, simple pen, probably made in 1910. And I bought it for $5 at a Laguna Beach estate sale. It was in a collection of jewelry. So if you kind of know what to look for, you can find these pieces out in the general public, just in swap meets. So they do exist. My wife has an exquisite Cirillos ring that she got at the Indian market in Santa Fe in 1970s. It's just totally beautiful. So these pieces are out and about. And then the other thing that I was going to say to you is that I've made a lot of good relationships with Navajo people. And from time to time, these pieces are put into a system called PAWN, and they become available. And so if you are befriended by them, sometimes they can locate these things on reservation. So certainly possible to get access to these historic heirloom pieces. They are privately sold from time to time.
Thank you, Richard. And another question was, how can you identify old silver beads from newer ones on necklaces? And do you have any advice or clues for us?
So
And, oh, hold on. And is it true that early work has no soldered links? So it's 3 questions.
yeah, so
Sorry.
So I was going to say to you, which is quite interesting, is that if you think about esoteric things that Facebook groups are created on, there's actually a good site on Facebook around beads and beads identification. So typically stamped and formed beads machine-wise became a necessity in the 1970s. And so to keep up with the demand for squash blossom necklaces that became very popular during 1975 to 78, there was a lot of machine-made beads that date from that period. And then the other thing is that because there was a shortage of turquoise, a lot of the turquoise used was stabilized or treated. So it means that it was deepened using resins and chemicals. So typically when I look at old beads, what I want to look for is hand stamped, very simple ways that they were kind of put together. And they call them Navajo pearls. And again, I'm not an expert in this area, but what I can tell you is that there's some really incredible sites on Facebook that are devoted to this subject. They can kind of tell you how these things evolved over the years. I myself collect the shell necklaces. I don't collect the squash blossoms, on a personal note.
The older beads usually have no seams, like when they're joined. And
Right.
This way, no seams is much better.
Yep.
And does the early work have no soldered links? That was the other question. Is it true that early work has no soldered links?
Yeah, solder wasn't something that was widely used. So I showed you those early Cerillos bracelets where they had the open gaps in the bezel. If you had access to solder, you would have had the ability to close that. So solder wasn't something that was used out on the reservation. They just used and manipulated pure silver. So that's true.
Okay. Thank you.
Richard, real
Yes.
quick, do the Navajo and the Apache ever share their jewelry designs? And has the Navajo ever used hairdo in their jewelry?
That's a really interesting question. I do see stylistic elements of Apaches. They have these things called ghost dancers. And I've seen that brought into Zuni design and Navajo design, where they recreate these ghost dancers for bolo ties, in particular the Zuni. So there is this kind of cross-cultural use of iconic design from the Apache to the Zuni and Apache to the Navajo. So I have seen these ghost dancers used many, many times in the creation of jewelry. I do not know any use of that stone in Navajo jewelry. What they have done though, with the advent of Charles Lolema the Hopi, bringing multi-stone inlay and making it popular in the 70s, they brought things like sugilite, and I've seen chrysoprase, I've seen Australian opal now being integrated into Navajo. The other thing that you have to also recognize, which is a huge problem for tribal art in general now, is that turquoise now, 90% of it's coming from China. And with COVID, none of it's coming over now these days. So most of the American mines are exhausted now for American turquoise. So probably from the 1990s on, most of the jewelry that I see is made using Chinese turquoise, most notably from a mining area called Cloud Mountain, which is right where the virus was detected and spread. So it's from Wuhan province in an area called Cloud Mountain. So it's quite interesting, and I say this to you, is that by a shortage of American turquoise, they've had to get pretty innovative and bring in new materials. Some other materials that they're using that they've adopted from the Eskimo is antique ivory, walrus ivory, bone, seen that brought in as well. So again, it's due to a general shortage of turquoise.
And the Chinese turquoise is becoming more valuable, and they're buying back a lot of it because all their mines are closing up also.
Yeah, it's a real problem now to get good quality, high grade turquoise. It's not readily available anymore. And it's fetching very high prices too. In my day, it's gone from $5 a carat to now top quality Bisbee, which is a mine that last produced in 1972. It's going for $300 a carat if you have the rough and finished stones now. So it's pretty amazing how turquoise has really changed and become a very valued, expensive stone.
Thank you for
More
good
questions? So Melinda, I have a question for you, Mel. Have you been able to find pieces from this era? Do you have any within your storefront?
I'm sure I do. I'm sure I do. I've got all kinds of errors down there. I've got some really, really wonderful things. I'm very particular about what I buy. Stones are very important to me. Condition of jewelry is very important to me. And I've got a big variety down there.
Does, and I will attest to that. This is from Melinda.
Very nice.
Very gorgeous necklace.
Thank you.
Clamshell Caraco Lake.
Nice.
And I've even got a little sneak in there of a tray of jewelry I've made with stones that I mined up at Royston and the Broken Arrow mine.
Very nice. So any more questions? If not, I'm going to say adios and have a nice dinner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It was a
Hey, is
wonderful
Marjorie around?
Thank you.
Everybody?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't see her.
Okay,
what?
well.
Oh, Marjorie?
Excellent.
I think
Okay, well, hopefully everybody will be unmuted and, all right, thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Richard, very
program.
much. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Richard.
everyone.
Fantastic.
Oh, Amy, I'll send you that video shortly.
Oh, that'd be great. I'd love that.
Yes.
And Margie gave me this, I took over for Marjorie. I honestly don't know how to close it. She said, just push the big red button.
Yeah, you can.
The
use
one that says
leave.
leave?
Liz.
Leave. Okay, so everybody
Yeah,
leave then, okay?
Liz.
Good night.
Okay.
Good night. It's over. Leave. Leave, everyone. Thank you for joining us, everyone. You're awesome. Thank
Thank
you.
you for taking over, Liz.
Liz,
You're awesome.
Liz,
Thank
you still
you.
there? Liz, are you
I'm
still
still
there?
here.
There was 2 of you on tonight. How come?
There was 3 of me. I have no idea. I was coming from Oceanside, so I was trying to log into my phone, but it wouldn't work. So I thought I closed it.
No, there's still
And-
somebody else on with your name.
I know it's 2 of me, probably from when I tried on my phone and then when I came home and did it on the computer. I
No,
am
they're
not tech savvy.
entirely different person, not you.
That was Amy.
Oh, that was Amy?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I was logged on 3 times at one point and I didn't know how to take them off. So,
Okay.
but I have the right numbers of how many people were here.
All right, sounds good, everybody. Well, have a good
Okay.
evening.
Good night.
Okay,
Night, night.
Sleep well.
okay, you too.
Thank you.
Just hit leave on the bottom. You guys can go bye-bye.
Okay. Goodbye. At least one of mine will.
Leave